Anyone messes with me and the whole camp goes.
Yeah, hey Dan. So let's kick this off. I was thinking with a movie that scared the living daylights out of me when I was a kid. I saw it when I was probably way too young, although I bet somebody might have seen it when they were younger and maybe endured it better than I did. But woo, it really scared me. And that is not the original, but the 81? Is it 81 or 80?
82, I think.
82 thing. I think there are some lessons to be learned in there. I think there are some interesting things, but that movie, I don't know about you, but I think it hit on the themes of uncertainty and suspicion. And you know what? I'm not sure about you, but I've experienced that in my workplace before.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that at work, and I've seen that within organizations. But I want to take a couple steps back to talk about this movie, The Thing.
Okay.
As you rightly say, there's actually 3 versions of The Thing. There's a 1982 version by John Carpenter. There's an old, I'm thinking 1960s, 50s version, and then there's a recent one in the teens, the 2000 teens or whatever,
which wasn't bad. It was not bad. It was no John Carpenter movie, which he's near.
No, the John Carpenter's probably the superior of the 3, and and I haven't watched the new one, so I can't really say, but I'll take your word. John Carpenter's a master. And I'll be honest. When I was a little kid, I watched it or portions of it, and I was bored. But now I was coming back to it, and as an adult and watching it based on your encouragement for this episode, I was like, well, there's some really important philosophical and to your point, organizational leadership themes embedded in that movie.
Yeah. I mean, obviously when I was a kid, I didn't walk and go, hey, I wonder how I'm going to apply this to my work experience as I get older. Although who knows, it might have been
when we have that alien invasion. And
it could have invaded my psyche somehow. I might treat people very suspiciously, concerned they're going to turn out to be some sort of alien clone. I don't know. But yeah, it's
how do you know they're not?
How do you know they're not? So let's count. If you mind, if we kick off with the idea here, talking about this. So we're Dan and I are kind of working this through to see how we're going to line this up to organizations. And I was thinking it might be fun, at least for this particular movie, is what would happen like an alien invasion. Like, yeah, there's some lessons to be learned around and analogies with the actual alien and the reactions. But what would happen? Let's just take a second here. What would happen if actually your organization succumbed to the events of The Thing? How would your organization react?
The audience might not have watched The Thing, so let's kind of recap,
yes,
right?
Okay, go for it.
So you got this team of scientists or people in Antarctica, right? And they are at a research station, we can assume. And unbeknownst to them, an alien spacecraft has crashed in that area, and there's a creature that has been unearthed by a bunch of Norwegians, because those Norwegians always kind of like to start trouble. And the movie opens with a helicopter crew of Norwegians chasing this poor dog through the Arctic plain, or through the snow, and they're shooting at this poor wolf-like dog, and you feel kind of sorry for the dog. It's like, but he's good. And you know what? The one thing that dog does right is it knows its active shooter response strategy, because it zigzags like through the snow so nobody can get a clean shot at it. It's a smart dog.
Well, to be honest,
that's because unbeknownst to us,
not a dog. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, well, it's a wolf, but it's inhabited. It's been inhabited by the alien creature.
At a cellular level. At a cellular level, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, because this thing is kind of like a virus that infects people's cells and replicates, so it becomes essentially a clone of the original being.
And you're never even sure if, like, the clone. They kind of hint that the person who's cloned might not even know. I don't know. I always kind of wondered, did the clone person did they always know they were cloned, or that was something
There's some ambiguity there.
Yeah, they never really kind of went into that, so they weren't sure of themselves if they were clones, which I think also has some implications from an organizational perspective. Like, where do you begin and end, and what are your ideas? So yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, the cute little doggy invades this new camp um, of people. The Norwegians die trying to kill the dog, and so the dog ends up at this new place. And quickly, the virus begins to spread. And Kurt Russell plays. Who's he play again?
Kurt Russell.
He plays the lead.
He's the lead. Yeah. He's the lead.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, he's the lead who's kind of like this macho, quiet helicopter pilot dude who kind of leads everybody in trying to address this alien invasion within their Antarctic compound.
Yeah, and the crux of it is that, again, as I think if you haven't gathered yet, is that throughout this, and we're not going to do a movie review of this here, but which I recommend anybody go see it. But the crux of it is that this alien is taking over bodies, and basically, how does this team first acknowledge that this event is even occurring, and secondarily, once they've identified it, how do they know who's been affected and who hasn't? Which, being originally a 1950s movie, it was all spawned from the concerns about the what's it called, communism. Yeah, so it's all about who's who and what do they know and all that kind of stuff.
Kind of like the invasion of the body snatchers.
Completely the same. They came out at the same time. It's another form of that movie. So, going back to the thought, so like I was kind of thinking, like, what would happen if if your organization was infected by this creature, how would your organization, and let's just pretend for whatever reason it was a normal company, not whatever, for whatever reason, a normal company, you come and go as you wish, you're not stuck out in the middle of the snow, it's your job. But what would happen? How would your organization? How would your organization react to like this? I mean, what would be like? How long would it take for your organization to find out that something like this was occurring? Let me first ask that question.
Oh, God, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I want to take a step back again and get back to that moral panic of around communism back in the 1950s, and it's kind of interesting that the root of that is being very concerned about the moral character inside of a person, because you have the exterior, what you can see, but do they have the right ideology inside of them? Is that, are they capitalistic or are they communistic?
Right.
And we can see waves of that in many different manifestations throughout history. And I definitely think we see it today too in organizations, which I'm not going to get into it because it's a little partisan and political probably, but which is not the nature of this podcast. But I don't know. I don't think my organization would be very effective at addressing it. I feel like and I think it's a natural human dimension to this, where there's a lot of denial, and you see it in the movie too, right? There's a lot of denial about what's going on and needing proof, and so denial is the first thing that you have to overcome, and then you get this realization that through the scientific method, right? Sort of, cinematic scientific method, which is not really true scientific method. This talking computer, this computer basically spelling out, that if this virus gets out of this compound, it's going to affect all of humanity. Within 24 hours.
That was a writer's method of getting us ramped.
Yeah. It works to a degree, but no, actually, it doesn't work to a degree. It kind of pulls you out of the movie. But I guess that gets to what I find most interesting about the film from an ethical point of view, is around ethical leadership, and that they have to make a choice. They know they're all going to die at some point in the film, that there's no way they're going to escape the compound that they're on. Late into the film, after all things break down. I mean, you've jumped to quite a bit there. I mean, there are a lot of things where they might have been able to solve problems, and then it gets to the point where they're like, you know what? We're not gonna survive this, and so we're gonna mitigate the damage to the rest of the world. But I think that there's a lot of stuff they could have possibly done before that. Well, let's go to that, Jodah, before we get to their moral choice at the end around self-sacrifice. I think your argument is that the toxic culture within that dynamic of men, right, inhibits
General,
them
yeah.
from being able to solve the problem.
Well, yeah, I think that's really what the movie is about. I mean, it is about mistrust, right? It feeds into like it was derived from, again, the red wave scare of the 50s, and so it literally spawned from the idea of how do you know your person next to you is who you think they are? How do you know you think you are? Because remember, people were thinking from the red wave that you were being brainwashed, so you might not even know you were brainwashed. So you could have been an agent and not even know it. So I do think there's a mistrust. And I was reading an article recently by Shelley D. Smith from Forbes. The article was titled "Lack of Trust Can Make Workplaces Sick and Dysfunctional." So, and it actually associates it like a virus, right? I mean, mistrust can feed into and break the relationships down, and we don't know what the relationships were of this team beforehand, right? It could have been good, it could have been bad, but what we saw is that this introduction of this novel virus. It could be a novel, from an organization perspective, a novel unknown, right? Something that's in there that you don't have an automatic response for, and so how does your team fix that? And this person suggests there are several signs, or 7 signs of mistrust in the organization, and they are: 1, no conflict or controversy, which I think is kind of interesting, meaning like people are too afraid to actually battle each other,
to raise issues.
Yeah. No accountability was another one, which is also really interesting. Few decisions, little actions, no results. Kind of feeds back into those first 2. Decisions made without the team, meaning leadership doesn't trust basically the team, so they just make decisions. Over attended meetings, I've seen that, where everybody distrusts everybody, so everybody has to be in the room, right? And it kind of, it's kind of like that scene with when he's in there with the blood, and you don't know who's who and what's doing what. He's got people tied up, and he's about to put this, the hot poker into the blood. I feel like I've been in meetings like that. Where you're kind of like you're in a hot room situation, and everybody's kind of in there, and
we're going to test to see if you're infected.
Yeah,
are you going to say something that's so outside of the orthodoxy
that's right.
of our institutional culture that we're going to be able to identify that you are an interloper?
That's
you're
right.
One of the aliens
that's
we
right.
don't want in our organization anymore.
Yeah, and then the last 2 are excessive oversight, which again is like, it kind of reminds me of decisions made about teams. And number 7, people withhold critical information, basically protectionism. Again, we saw that in this movie, right? People
siloing.
They were totally siloing, right? Maybe they were kind of they weren't telling everybody everything because they were concerned the other person might have been infected. They weren't sure. I mean, all those things, I think, to some degree, were reflective in that movie.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I would say that it's even very transactional in their engagement with each other. There's not a lot of understanding or time. They're saying there's not a lot of time that they're spending, and maybe they shouldn't because it's in a crisis moment, where they're being invaded by an alien virus in a sense. But there's not a lot of time spent on recognizing that we're going through this traumatic experience together, right? And it's like, you either do this or why didn't you do the right thing at this particular moment? No time for really processing what's going on, or really, really engaging in sense making and understanding the group dynamics.
Yeah. And
and
that's interesting because a lot of, again, going back to sense making, in the sense making world, in the post-industrial age, you really want to have that time for sense making. And sometimes unknowns come into a situation that are so cosmically unknown to whatever you're trying to do that there was no way to prepare or plan for it. And so how far do you take that planning? And there's this level of uncertainty. And before we go on to the existential thing you want to talk about, I want to bring up the uncertainty aspect of this movie as well, right? So there's mistrust, but then there was this whole level of uncertainty that was imposed upon this team. And how do they engage in that? And uncertainty, of course, part of the uncertainty was that manifested of the mistrust. And again, another person, a Dr. Karen was her name, from Organizational Relationship Systems Coach. I'll put her website in a link. She identifies several things as ways of kind of managing uncertainty, because we all have to deal with that. And she lists out 5 things or 6 things, and I'll read those off. Recognize what you know and you don't know. So you can totally supplant that on top of this movie. Were they trying to figure out what they knew and didn't know? And yeah, they were, right? And they were grasping at straws, except what's out of your control. That's when they said, you know what? We don't control this. We're going to all die here and we're going to save the world. They accepted something they couldn't control this thing, but they could mitigate damage. And that we can get to that in a second. I think that kind of revolves around what you're talking about. Ask for help when appropriate, right? Kind of scary in this situation because you weren't sure who your friend was or your enemy was. Think positively. I don't know how they could have. Look at this monster eating. It'd been pretty hard to be positive.
I don't think there's one character in that movie who has a positive mindset. No, they're definitely not thinking in terms of growth mindset. It's like, we're all going to die.
But, could you imagine if they written in a positive character when it was like, hey, it's not that bad. Hey, we can get out of this, like all the way through it. And then finally, building resilience, right? And that's kind of what I think they had was, if anything, like McClurdy or whatever, what's his name, the main character, he had a sense of resilience. He was going to make sure this alien dies, whether he makes it or not. Although towards the end of the movie, you get the vibe he was hoping to live, right? So anyways, with that said, this notion you're talking about of this ethical question, I think it kind of does pertain to that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me from a leadership perspective is the ethical question. I think at the core at the core of the end of the film, right? Once they've got to a point where they realize there's the helicopter's destroyed, all the transportation's destroyed, the building is on fire. They're not going to get out alive, and they have to make the choice about what they're going to do next. And it becomes a question of sacrifice, and they go to the ends of their ability. They use all of their abilities and all their resources to destroy the monster, the invader, so that it doesn't spread and infect the rest of the world. And the movie closes with Kurt Russell and one of the other guys kind of sitting together. The whole place is burning, the alien's dead, and you get a sense as the credits start to roll that they're going to freeze to death once the fire burns out, and that's not going to be a good end for them in the long, at the end of the day. But they prevented a global catastrophe, and I think that I think from a leadership point of view, the self-sacrifice for the sake of the larger mission is a really important concept or value that I think leaders need to have, because I think leadership is about pursuing something that's bigger than the individual.
Well, it can be. And yeah, you're right. I mean, yes, exactly. I mean, there's that sort of one of the lessons that can be taken away is organizations have a lot of, especially very large ones, have a lot of decisions to be made that can impact so many aspects of our civilization. And, it's behooving upon that leadership to try to not be narrow-minded or short-sighted in those for just the final dollar sake. Because those guys, and they were trying to survive, but those guys could have just said, screw it, I'm going to get the hell out of here. I'm going to be myself. And some of those guys did try to do that and they died. Yeah.
And I think it's also a good lesson in crisis management and preparation too. That what happened, who could have forecast or predicted that they would have an alien invasion that would take the form of this virus, right?
Yeah. Well, how do you?
It's kind of like a virus shutting the world down for 2.5 years. It's unpredictable, although it's always a possibility that something could happen. And I think one of the core tenets of crisis management and why leaders need to think about crisis management is the preparation, because crisis can come in many forms, and they clearly did not have a plan.
They did not.
For how to address a crisis when it emerged. They didn't have any protocols in place. Everything was kind of ad hoc decisions.
All out for themselves. Each person was literally out for themselves, which you saw. So I'm going to go back on what I said. I think without them having to explicitly state it, I think they were probably a bunch of mavericks who were doing their own thing, and they weren't working as a team. And it started off them not necessarily working as a team,
Yeah. So and I think that gets to the point of, organizations need to figure out how they work as a team, build a culture of trust, develop protocols and plans for when unexpected events happen, like alien invasions, and and you'll be more resilient as a result of this. So this is just a case study in what happens if you don't do those things.
It absolutely is. And I think, yeah. All right. So that's enough, I think, about The Thing. And again, I recommend people to go see the movie. It's actually a classic. It didn't come out. When it came out, it got kind of panned by reviewers. It was too gory, too heavy, too dark for a lot of the critics. I think Roger
But today it would be nothing, right?
Today is,
I mean, it's still, but it's,
I would say nothing, but
I mean, graphic wise,
it's, I wouldn't say that. I actually think, well, that's for a different show. I think the effects in a weird way.
The special effects are excellent.
Yeah.
Later in this episode, we would talk about Q the Flying Serpent, where the F special effects are questionable. The special effects in the 1982 thing still feel very contemporary. They are graphic, but not as graphic as some stuff that you'd see today. I would still argue, but it's still a fine film. And like I said, when I was a kid, I thought it was boring as shit. Now I think it's an excellent film and has a lot of lessons to teach us about organizational leadership.
And just to be clear, Dan considers himself a child up until he was 29. So you can say, who knows?
That's true.